Nikki here. I'm here today to do another one of my kind of end of the year videos. This one is my top 10 favorite reads for 2019. This is a list. I may not have necessarily rated these all 5 stars, but upon reading them or rereading them, there's something about them that stuck with me and just made them some of my favorite books of the year. I'll start at the bottom of my list and work my way up to my number 1 book. Number 10 on my list is Kind of Cruelty by Araminta Hall. This is a contemporary thriller, and honestly, it was just one of the most disturbing reads this year. The main character just gave me chills. The book itself is about a kind of stalker ex-boyfriend and his obsession with his now ex-girlfriend, who is going to be getting married to someone else. And he's convinced that this is just part of their love story, and it is absolutely terrifying. And it really stuck with me. Number 9 is the Lord of the Rings series by J.R.R. Tolkien. Although everybody is probably familiar with it, it is a high fantasy series by someone who's considered kind of the father of modern fantasy. And it is a trilogy that is an epic adventure about a talented but kind of ragtag group who is out to destroy one of the tools of the great evil that is trying to take over the world, and their ultimate goal is to prevent the fall of everything they know. I think this is an amazing series, and it was just such an interesting read, and you just really went on an epic journey with the characters. My 8th favorite book of the year is The 7 Husbands of Evelyn Hugo. This one I actually was also very surprised at. I wasn't sure if I was going to enjoy it. It's kind of a contemporary fiction novel with like mixtures of like romance, LGBTQ plus representation, and the author, Taylor Jenkins Reid, just did a really good job with it. The story itself is about this reclusive old Hollywood movie star who has been very, very quiet about her private life, but when the book is taking place, she has reached out to this kind of unknown young reporter and wants to tell her whole story, including everything about her love life and her infamous 7 husbands, as the title indicates. It was a very, very good read, and honestly, I loved that there was a protagonist that I, by turns, hated and adored. My 7th favorite read this year is An Unkindness of Magicians. This one I actually found because of another YouTube channel I watch. Her name is Murphy Napier. I'll try to remember to include a link below to her channel. She is phenomenal, and I think she does a really awesome job with reviews, and it's definitely what convinced me to read this. The story is basically magic mafia. I've heard it kind of otherwise described as adult Harry Potter, and that's not quite right. It definitely does have more of a mafia feel. Every 20 years, there's this tradition where all of the magical houses battle it out for power over the magic world. And this specific turn, you have your main character, Sydney, and she is completely overpowered and completely out for blood. And it just makes for a very interesting read, and the world is terrifying, but also kind of fun to be in. My 6th favorite read is Ender's Game. This was honestly a reread for me, but any year I read this book, it is going to be in the top 10 because it is fabulous. It's easily one of my favorite science fiction novels of all time. For those of you not familiar with it, it is about a young boy who is kind of the savior of humanity from this alien race, and you're following him as he's trying to become that leader that they need to save the world, while he is actively trying not to be destroyed by his instructors and the people that have power over him. It is a very, very interesting read, and I adore it every time I pick it up. I highly recommend it to anybody who hasn't read it yet. And that is it for the bottom half of my top 10 list. We are now moving into the top 5, which were, with the exception of my number 1 read, numbers 2 through 5 were pretty interchangeable, but they're all good, and I would highly recommend any of them. Number 5 is The Golem and the Genie by Helen Wecker. This one, I was really surprised about, if only because it was more like historical fiction with a smattering of fantasy, and I thought it was going to be the other way around. It's a really interesting tale about these two people. One is a golem, one is a genie, as the title indicates, and they are navigating their way through turn-of-the-century New York in the kind of immigrant neighborhoods, and it's really them exploring how to be individuals within the neighborhoods from which they have arisen. So the golem is part of a Jewish neighborhood, and the genie is part of, I believe it's a Syrian one. And it was just a very, very interesting tale, and with just these two really incredible personalities. And it was phenomenal to just go on this journey with them. Number 4 is The Alice Network by Kate Quinn. This one is, parts of it were really hard to listen to because one of your main characters is a spy during World War I. She's part of the underground female spy network in France during the First World War. And those parts were very interesting and sometimes just incredibly disturbing. And these are kind of contrasted with the other point of view is a disowned girl post World War II, and she is her family is kind of in the process of disowning her, and she decides to take charge of her own life and go on a hunt for her lost cousin. She disappeared in France during the Second World War, and they can't find any guaranteed signs of death. They can only find that she is missing, and this is giving this other perspective, this girl in their other perspective just drive to try to sort out multiple parts of her life, including her love and grief for her cousin. My third favorite book this year was Foundation by Isaac Asimov. I have been burned by some classic sci-fi this year. I haven't really done any reviews on them. However, Foundation by Isaac Asimov is completely put me back onto the classic sci-fi route. There was something that was just absolutely amazing about it. They call it a space opera, and I get it because it is written in very distinct acts. But it was interesting. There was political machinations, there were coups, there was psychology, there was math. It was such an interesting mix of all those elements that I had a really hard time putting it down, and thankfully it was a thin book, so I didn't waste too much time just being completely absorbed in it, ignoring the outside world. My second favorite book this year was The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks by Rebecca Skloot. This was actually a nonfiction that I just finished recently, and it is absolutely amazing. It is horrifying and heartwarming. It is the nonfiction story of Henrietta Lacks. She was a woman who cells from her cervical tumor were taken without her consent in the 50s, and they were used in some research to try to generate cell culture lines for medical research, and against all odds, it worked. Her cells became a cell line with which medical research could be conducted. However, there has been a lot of kind of controversy surrounding it because these cells were taken without the patient's or the family's consent, and it discusses kind of the laws surrounding that. It discusses the life of the woman Henrietta Lacks from everybody that was still alive who knew her, and that part was so heartwarming. Just putting a face to the woman and really understanding what kind of life she lived and what kind of life she could have lived had she not died due to cancer. And then it also covers the life of her cells. It's an immortal cell line, so it kind of infinitely reproduces, and they touch on all of the medical kind of revelations that occurred because of it. And I have to say, like, these three different things just came together and wove such a wonderful and interesting story that, like I had said already, was by turns horrifying and heartwarming. And it was just an amazing experience. It caught me completely by surprise. I figured I'd like it, but I didn't think I'd love it. And this leads to my #1 book of the year for 2019. Although I know it wasn't published this year, as most of my books have not been. I read it probably in March, and it just has stuck with me all year, and I cannot wait to pick it up and read it again. And it is All the Light We Cannot See by Anthony Doerr. It's a historical fiction novel, and there's just something about this one specifically that just tugged on all of my heartstrings and had me rooting for both characters. You follow a blind French girl in occupied France, and you follow a poor German boy who kind of gets sucked up into the Nazi regime, starting with kind of the Hitler Youth schools and then into the army. This was one of the most heart-wrenching novels I've read. It was beautifully written, and the ending was just phenomenal. I cannot say it enough. This book was absolutely mesmerizing, and for anybody that really enjoys historical fiction and doesn't mind a somewhat meandering plot, because you are kind of following the journeys that these two characters took, I really recommend this book. It's one of those books that just stuck with me, and I expect it to stick with me for a long time to come. And that's my top 10 list. These are all books that I really adored the journey that they took me on, and I felt that they just really deserved to be mentioned again, and they were my favorite reads this year. I will see you guys in the next video. Bye!